Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Dionyssis Dimitrakopoulos. I'm the curator of this vlog, the Talking Europe vlog series, which I created last year in an effort to showcase to a broader audience Europe-related expertise that exists not only in the Department of Politics at Birkbeck, but also more broadly in other departments at Birkbeck. As of last September, the vlog is curated under the auspices of the Jean Monnet Chair in Parliamentary Democracy and European Integration, which I hold at Birkbeck. And today it's a great pleasure for me to present Antonella Patteri, who recently completed her doctoral dissertation in the Department of Politics on migration issues in Europe, supervised by Antoine Bousquet and Jason Edwards. I have invited Antonella to answer a couple of questions which I have on migration issues for a number of reasons. One I mentioned already, the original idea behind the vlog was to showcase research on Europe conducted in various parts of Birkbeck, but also because the European Commission has recently made proposals regarding migration policy. And of course, migration in general remains an issue with which not only the European Union collectively, but also individual countries in Europe are concerned with. So, welcome, Antonella. Thanks very much for giving your time to this joint endeavor. My first question is this. There is a standard way of approaching migration and what migration is. Would you like to describe this standard way of approaching migration in public discourse and in policy terms as well, both at the level of the EU and the level of individual European states?
So thanks for inviting me to the vlog. As we know, migration is a very complex issue. Since 2014, 2015, Europe, the European Union discovered to have a migratory problem through the construction of migration as a crisis. Since then, there's been an urgent need to address the problem that relate to migration and the way, especially in which the European Union approaches migration. We have, for example, discovered that the European project lacks integration. Communitarian decisions sometimes are approached actually in terms of nation-based decision, and so on. Migration is not only topical because of European Union policies who actually try to challenge the way in which it's managed, but also is topical because migration is something that researchers, politicians, scholars, anyone needs to deal with, and we all have a responsibility towards constructing a positive idea of it. I believe the standard way in which the European Union has approached migration presents four main problems. The first problem, I would call it a problem of construction of the crisis and a problem of construction of the figure of the migrant. So the European Union has never really dealt with migration as a structural issue, but has dealt more as an emergency issue. Something to deal with in the temporary moment in which the problem was coming into being. That's why since the 2013, 2014, 2015, we have this construction of the problem of migration as a crisis. On the one hand, there is also a problem of language. The crisis constructed as migration crisis. What that means? That means that by calling it migration crisis per se, the responsibilities of migration are given to migrants themselves. Migrants are those who provoke migration, those who need to be blamed for migration, those who need to be contained because they are arriving into huge numbers. So this is the first problem, which is a terminological one. What does it do? What does it hide, this framing? This framing hides real responsibilities through the Europe has in dealing with migration itself. The construction of violent borders, the idea of policing borders, the idea of or actually asserting a policy of containment that through which migrants can only reach Europe through unsafe routes, perpetuating then the plague of migrants, perpetuating the violence of these borders. According to many scholars, in fact, the borders of European are the deadliest in the world, the most unsafe, the one that's more patrolled, the one that are absolutely, are absolutely put people journeys and people life at risk. So there is the first problem of construction of the crisis. On the second problem is a problem of Europe itself and the construction of the political projects. It comes to my mind here the poet and writer Edouard Glissant when he talks about the fact that the West is not in the West. The West is not a place, is a project. And it comes this idea of the construction of Europe has always been at the center of the world. Europe has been at the center of the West, of the Westernized project. And at the same time, Europe, with the evolution of the creation of the European Union, has attempted to be at the center of this of a political project. As we will know, the European Union is not just an economic project, which may be more successful in according to certain policies, but it's also a political project. It's a project that attempts to keep together different countries with different identities, and it's a project that somehow on the one hand there is the people of Europe, on the one hand there is the people of the nation states, and it's always an integration process which is never really complete. It's always coming into being, and migration then plays a huge role in perpetuating this myth of European identity, the purity of Europe, the idea in which Europe as a fortress Europe, this idea of strict borders in which we need to keep, you need to wall them in order then to keep the integrity of Europe identity itself. And we will know this is a project that actually is has many problems, one of which the idea in which you cannot have identity, a European identity, and nationalism at the same time. How you can keep the two together? You can have them, but how you keep them together in a way that created then a communitarian project. So migration is putting in jeopardy the political project itself, not migration itself, but the way in which Europe is responding to migration. Because as a matter of principle, as a matter of fact, migration is never a problem. If it is more of a problem in the case of Europe is the way in which it's managed, and that's a different kind of issue. And then there is a problem of migration policies. Why migration policies matter? Because they affect migrant life on the ground, they affect the way in which they can reach Europe, whether or not they can access, according to international law, European law, international protection, and how they can actually claim asylum safely. One of the most important ways in which Europe has addressed the problem of migration, the so-called problem of migration, has been that of the externalization of its own borders. So with the birth of the European Union and the implementation of the Schengen area, borders have not been simply dismantled, or border checks are not simply dismantled within the European Union, because border actually persist, bordering practice still persists, only they have moved from within the European Union to outside the European Union. So the European Union, through partnership with African countries, in this case, have somehow relegated the problem of migration and externalized the problem of migration to countries of origin and transit. And why that's problematic? That's problematic because sometimes, like in the case of Libya, for instance, those countries, they don't have a proper track on human rights, but the European Union still think it's better to financially invest in those countries and try to deter migrants from coming to Europe. Well, this is also problematic because then migrants cannot safely claim asylum to the so-called policies of deterrence. And at the same time, there are different kinds of policies, like the creation in 2015 of hotspots, the persistence of a policies of reception in which people are treated in a certain way, in a certain way, and also the so-called island model of confinement. We see that's very dramatic. Somehow nation state and Europe itself is transferring its border, its mainland border to the island which belong to those states, like the Greek island, Lampedusa in the case of Italy. And there is somehow a certain way in which people then are being managed in islands. You know, there is more secrecy, there is, you know, somehow less attention on the migratory problem itself, and they want to keep people in a sort of limbo in between worlds. You have reached Europe, but you are in an island, so you are not yet into Europe, and that's become easier than to process returns, which is actually one of a very dangerous politics of the European Union itself, the idea of returns. And then I believe there is also a fourth main problem, which is the problem of the so-called solidarity. Since its birth, the European Union has flagged on different values. One of the main values has been that of solidarity. What means solidarity? Solidarity not just among member states, but solidarity in a partnership in the global view of supporting nation states around the world. One of the ideas of solidarity, it means also that you need to understand exactly when there is the need for people to for people and for institutions to actually understand the problem of migrants, not just a problem of management, but also problems that call into questions what citizens can also do to support migrants during their quest, for example, for applying for asylum, on humanitarian ground or legal ground, and so on. Well, according to the EU directive, which has been proposed and implemented by the European Union, migrants are not only the ones who are being targeted by these violent policies, but also citizens and organizations led by citizens and grassroots organizations themselves are being constantly subjected to this kind of violent policing. Why this is problematic? It's problematic because somehow the European Union is shifting attention on citizens, and there raise the question, who is a smuggler then today? If citizens have been treated like a smuggler, like those who are actually perpetuating and helping migrants to cross illegally borders, then it raises the question, which is the kind of solidarity that we want within the European Union, not just when it comes as a value that's been proposed per se in institution, but also on the ground. And I believe all these problems together, which are very complex and which is to be able to put together or even to identify them, because they're all interlinked problems that are explained everyday management migration, perpetuate an idea of a Europe who can actually act as a collective actor, an idea of Europe who always needs to challenge itself, who needs to challenge its member states, who need to find always ways through which the rhetoric of human rights and the reality of violent borders can come somehow coexist. And these are very important questions. How can Europe secure its borders but also protect people at the same time? Because this is the main logic through which Europe is actually acting on the management of migration nowadays.
Thank you. This is fascinating stuff that is also linked to your thesis. But since the response to the first question is highly critical, which I welcome, obviously, can I then ask, what is your preferred or what is an alternative way of approaching migration that you would see as preferable?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Yeah, I think, again, as I started this talk saying that migration is a very complex issue. I believe nobody has a simple solution to the problem. I feel only there is ways in which, for example, academics and researchers can help to reframe the problem differently. There is a very important work on the construction that academics can do. The construction of a crisis is the construction of a certain way of the only way, or univocal way in which Europe portrays migration itself. So first of all, I think from an institutional point of view, I think Europe needs to address the problem of the implementation gap. What is the problem with the implementation gap? Is the problem when we see violent policies, and then rhetorically we see those violent policies as well, but we also see there is a lot of attention on human rights. Rhetorically, in the European Union talks about how to find a human response to migration, but then actually in reality, and that's when I talk about the implementation gap between reality and rhetoric, we see that things are completely different. There is still violent policing, there is the idea of containment that is more and control that's more important than the idea of actually allow to have a different perspective toward migration. In the Europe tried to attempt to propose legal pathways through which migrants then can reach Europe, but then this poses always a question. How can a nation, we have already those legal pathways. The reason why many people come without following that kind of rules is because they wouldn't meet the criteria to come to Europe legally. So it's a bit difficult. It's a conversation of illegality and legality, but then at the end, it's not possible just to reconcile the two according to what European Union prescribe illegality and legality. I think another important point is that the European Union should end the policies of deterrence. What that means? People are, especially the migrants, which are somehow already the status, the legal status attached to them just because they are crossing borders illegally. So there is all this idea that the European Union needs to deter people from coming to Europe, because the people that are coming to Europe are already somehow criminalized a priori, seen as people which the European Union needs to defend its population from. So there is this construction of the figure of the migrant, which is very confusing. On the one hand, we have migrants who may represent a threat to the identity and life of the European population in the European Union. On the other hand, we have this figure of the migrant, which actually a figure that we need to support, to enable, to guarantee some rights. And I think this confusion then creates is at the core of violent policies. And so this is also important things: address deterrence and address the idea of violent policies and so on. On the other hand, we need to understand that that when we talk, for example, illegality from the point of view of a state-centric category, it hides and conceals the potential that migrants have to act and to express their own politics as well. So I think it's very important to move away from categories like illegality and regularity, which tells us more about how you exclude people, and to also look at how migration can be a positive asset to the country that's benefiting from the arrival of migrants. Why making Let's be clear, if there were no borders, wouldn't have been migrants themselves. So once there are borders, there is the figure of the migrant, only that. I may be a qualified migrant. I am a qualified migrant if I move away from my country of birth, that's Italy. But there are people who actually don't have the privilege, and they become, and then illegality becomes embodied. It can become something that defines them. And I believe it's very important then to put attention about building a stronger, even European civic education. There is a lot of question mark about what is Europe, a nation state, the way in which people are approaching the European project. And I believe the European project can coincide with arrival of migrants, can coincide with a better management of migration. But to understand that, people of Europe also needs to be, if there are people of Europe, people from different nation states in Europe also need to converge on the idea that migration can be beneficial, and that can come through a very strong European civil education, understanding the history of Europe. Another important point then when it comes to education is to not treat migration an ahistorical issue. Suddenly, we are finding out that there are many people who speak English, who speak French, who are rich in Europe. What's that? Why is that? Why there is linked with the post-colonial Europe? What are those links? And try to understand the complex interlink of the making in Europe of a post-colonial project, right? And the construction of identity within this project. I think that's also a very important thing. And now, just to make reference to say a few things about the new Pact of Migration and Asylum that's been proposed, is a legislative proposal by the Commission that's been published on the 23rd of September 2020. I found very interesting how somehow the European Union is taking responsibilities for some, after 5 or 6 years in which has been mostly legislating about how to deal with the crisis, with the so-called crisis. Different things are very, very positive. For example, the idea of having a comprehensive approach to the study of migration instead of having it in a nation-based one. The idea of how it's important to redefine some to redefine some ways in which migration has been managed through stops. The idea of avoiding asylum orbiting, so that means people orbiting in different places of the European Union without actually have a clear understanding of what is the condition. And also, I think it's very welcome the purpose of creating a specific agency, a new European agency of asylum, because one of the things has been that one of the most important problems has been that there has not been coordination on asylum application between European directives and so on, and European and specific nation states. All of these are very welcome purposes, and you can sense that something is being done on the right direction. On the other hand, and this is, I feel, is very problematic, Europe is trying to deal with the so-called migratory problem with implementing more securitarian policies. For instance, another part of the proposal has been that of creating a standing corps of 10,000 officers, which can actually patrol borders. So we somehow the response is always that can generate more violent journey for people, and immigration itself can become more unsafe. As I was telling you, all of this is very positive, but the problem of hard policing persists. So there are actually gaps in the way in which you are again addressing a more human treatment for people who can actually apply for asylum, or people actually who can have their application checked, and so on, through certain standard of implementation of these rules. But on the other hand, you are trying also to the policies of deterrence, to the policing and hard policing to perpetuate a situation that's very difficult. So I think all of this is creating a very confused and even more confused scenario for Europe itself and for the management of migration within it.
Yeah. I must say I'm very intrigued by this response, in particular because, as you indicate it in your response, there are both positive and negative aspects of the proposal, which itself reflects an attempt to compromise competing views of what migration is and how it should be handled by the EU. Antonella, thank you very much indeed for joining us for the vlog, and hopefully we will have the opportunity to welcome you back as your thinking and your research develop. For the time being, congratulations on the completion of your thesis.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.